This video is brought to you by Magic Spoon. Go to magicspoon.com/movies for a special offer and stay tuned after the video for more info. Hello everybody and welcome to my review of the last two episodes of Star Wars The Acolyte. That would be episodes 5 and 6. Because the episodes are already out, these are going to be full spoiler reviews. So if you haven't seen the latest episodes, then you should pause the video, go watch them, and then come back because I'm not going to break it into non-spoiler and spoiler sections. And let's pick up right where we left off, which was at the end of episode 4, which I said felt like half an episode, and last week's episode, episode 5, really was the second half of that fourth episode. We pick up with this fight between the Jedi and the mysterious Sith bad guy. And at least it was a worthy payoff because I think episode 5, which was called Night, while flawed, was the best of the series so far, mainly because it featured mostly exciting battles and huge character deaths. It was basically a great payoff to a not so great setup, and I was really surprised that both Yord and Jeki were killed off. This was one example where subverting your expectations actually worked, because you think maybe one of them would go, but not both of them because they've been built up to be such major characters. And while we were inside that battle sequence, it really felt like an exciting Star Wars show with good action that was well shot and well edited, with stakes that actually seemed to matter. But being the best episode of the show so far doesn't mean that episode 5 was without its flaws, and they were mainly sort of superstructural series flaws that I had coming out of the fourth episode regarding some things that they had set up that I was hoping they would kind of swerve on, because it was stuff that seemed pretty obvious when you looked at that last episode. I thought it was extremely obvious that Kamir was the masked Sith, and when it came time for the big reveal, it was, shocker, Kamir, who also appears to actually be the main antagonist of the show. This was so heavily telegraphed that I was really almost expecting that they were going to do something to surprise us. But unless there is another big reveal coming in these last two episodes, then this Sith Master, this Sith Lord or whatever, is Kamir, and it looks like the big reveal is going to be who his Jedi Master was and just how long ago it was that he was a Jedi in training. It is somewhat surprising, I guess, that he's a former Jedi. As to who his master is, again, I think it's fairly obvious, because if you have a Jedi in the show who is a major figure but hasn't really had that much to do yet, that means that they have a major part to play later on in the series. And if you want my theory, I think that it's Vernestra, because she's been kind of hanging around for a while and now she's getting more involved in the action. They're obviously setting her up to play this big part, and we also have a mystery Jedi who's yet to be revealed. This isn't a show that's about swerving. This is a show that telegraphs what's going to happen pretty clearly. So the smart money for me is on Vernestra as the former Jedi Master of Kamir. I also hope the show would address May's sudden change of heart to turn herself into the Jedi. Not only did it turn out to just be what I think is a poorly written character beat, but then they had her turn on a dime again in episode 5 and decide in the moment to impersonate her sister with a quick lightsaber haircut and ditch her on Kafar. And really, to me, it seems like the only reason that these character changes happened was because they needed to put the characters in certain places for the rest of the show to happen, which I don't think is very satisfying narratively. If you need to get these characters into specific places, then you need to support that with the storytelling. And I haven't seen that storytelling support there. It really seems to be contrived to get them to places where they don't necessarily have a reason to be without establishing what those reasons are. One thing they did do is pay off the big jungle bugs that were introduced in episode 4, so technically they did address that criticism that I had. But I found it pretty comical that they just picked up Kamir like the monkeys from The Wizard of Oz until he could fight off enough of them to land again. Still though, my issue was addressed, if not completely satisfactorily. The show still is making, though, some really weird editing choices, and I think a great example of that is in that 5th episode when Osha and May come face to face. They briefly saw each other earlier in the series, but this is the first big meeting between sisters, and we see them facing each other. It's this kind of big dramatic moment, and then there's a Star Wars wipe to an establishing shot of the planet that we're already on, and then we cut to a shot of the two of them basically where they were seemingly moments later. And as an editor, this just drives me crazy because there's no reason to put that cut there. You don't change location, there's not a time jump. all it does is diffuse what should be a very dramatic moment. You need to let that moment breathe. You need to let the character soak it in. You need to let the audiences soak it in. And there's no editorial explanation that makes any kind of sense to me of why you would do an establishing shot and reset the shot when you're in the exact same place at the exact same time. It's an unintelligible choice, in my opinion. So episode 5 ends with May posing as OSHA. It seems like some high drama stakes here. And then we get to last night's episode, which was called Teach Corrupt. And given the uneven nature of the show so far, I guess maybe I should have predicted that they would follow what I think was the series' best episode with what, in my opinion, was their worst episode so far by far. Now, I want to make something very clear. I think that a lot of the criticisms that are being made about the Acolyte are not being made in good faith. However, I think there are a lot of people out there who say that any criticism of the show is being made in bad faith. And I don't agree with that either. I think that there are plenty of people out there like me that have issues with the plot, the tone, the pacing, the characters, the acting, the writing, stuff that is completely disconnected from who's making the show or who's starring in the show. And I don't think that that should just be disregarded by saying like, oh, well, you know what you're really masking. You know what you're really hiding. No, listen, the criticisms that I have for this last episode of The Acolyte, if Christopher Nolan himself had come down and guest written and directed this episode, I would have the exact same criticisms, because it is these fundamental parts of storytelling and show making that I think it's consistently now falling short. So I'm going to break down specifically several examples regarding that just to show where I think it's really just not doing its job very well. After opening this episode with, by my count, the 4th shot of May or OSHA waking up suddenly, this is the 2nd consecutive episode that started with that shot, we pick up back on the ship with Sol and May, who's posing as OSHA. And this episode, I think, asks us to believe that Sol is a really bad Jedi. First, he doesn't sense that May is an imposter, despite Jedi demonstrating an ability to sense other specific Force users many times in the movies and shows. And he doesn't even sense that May is behind him with a knife, seemingly ready to kill him, despite, again, the Jedi demonstrating a consistent ability to sense danger. Now, a lot of people will point as an answer to that criticism to the conversation that Sol and May have about how he's been so blind and how can he not sense these intentions, and maybe he's only seeing what he wants to see. And I guess you can use that as an explanation, but for me, from a writing standpoint, that just kind of feels like a writer who's trying to back themselves out of a plot hole than somebody who's constructing a story where it all makes sense. If you want to have a storyline where Sol's Jedi powers are clouded, then you can do that, but you have to set that up throughout the series. What we've seen so far of Sol is that he's a pretty competent Jedi. He was fighting extremely well in the previous episode, and yet here he's just kind of bumbling around in the dark. The Jedi being short-sighted has been a plot point in Star Wars movies and shows before, but it's all about the setup, and I think that's what you're missing here. Sol is only not able to use the Force very well when it's convenient for him to not be able to use the Force very well, but he's still able to use it really well when the show needs him to, and I think that that is not very good writing. That is taking the in-universe laws of a show or a series and only applying them where the plot needs you to, and that's an issue for me. It also doesn't help that in the same episode, we see Force users both sensing the specific presence of someone nearby and sensing danger behind them and reacting to it. But this is not a deal breaker for me. Despite my skepticism, I will just narrowly grant the show the very shaky premise that Sol isn't able to really use his Jedi powers because of this huge amount of emotional duress. And if that was my only issue with the episode, then I could move past it. But it's just one of a list of things that I think points to some pretty short-sighted writing. While May is successfully fooling Sol, OSHA is now on a planet that looks a lot like Octo or Act 2 or however you pronounce it with Kamir, and I'm pretty sure it is Octo because the show went out of its way to label it on screen as Unknown Planet, which really only makes sense if you're later going to reveal that it's Octo. I also thought we were going to have our first Disney Plus Star Wars butt as Kamir bays while OSHA contemplates killing him. And was it really necessary for her to obviously check out his organic lightsaber when he got out of the water? I'll leave that decision to you. Kamir is now trying to make OSHA his Acolyte, which is something that he was trying to do with May before they switched places. And he actually gives a pretty enticing speech about the fact that Jedi only have a very narrow set of ways that you can access the Force, but he's discovered ways to access it using deep emotions like
anger, fear, loss, desire.
And if you're even a casual Star Wars fan, you know that emotions like fear and anger are a path to the dark side, which is why you don't need a character to specifically say,
"That's the path to the dark side."
That's another issue I have with the writing of the show. It's spoon-feeding the audience information that they don't need to be spoon-fed. You can have that same scene and that same speech from Kamir where he's talking about fear and anger and that ability to access the Force through those emotions. And if you play that scene off of Osha's reaction, she's trained as a Jedi. She knows that it's a path to the dark side. Kamir knows it's a path to the dark side. You don't have to say it out loud. And if you focused instead on her reaction and watching her process that information, I think that it would be a lot more effective than just a blanket verbal, "it's bad" statement. We all already know that fear and anger and hate are a path to the dark side, but subtlety has never really been this show's strength, nor, quite frankly, has good dialogue. At one point, Kamir tells Osha,
"I lost everything, Osha. But when you lose everything, that's when you're finally free."
And I sat there thinking, where have I heard that line before? Until it hit me, oh, Tyler Durden.
It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything.
The dialogue generally, I thought, was really weak in this episode, and I thought that that elicited some pretty weak performances from the cast, especially Amanda Stenberg. She is a really good actor. I've seen her in so many things where she's very, very good, but she's not very good in the show, and I think the writing has a lot to do with it.
You're a criminal, May. You must pay for your crimes. What are you doing? What I came here to do. Arrest you.
Manny Jacinto has been getting a lot of praise for his performance as Kamir, and I will say I think he's doing the best with the material out of all the cast, but it all just feels so flat and uninspired, and that's even more apparent in an episode like this, which is the crux, it seems, of Osha's story for the entire series. If the director of the episode had been able to get consistently good performances with the subpar dialogue, then I think maybe the episode would have played better, but the combination of not great dialogue and largely not great acting, I think was pretty rough for this 6th episode. There were also some changes that to me felt like stuff that was done in post-production when people realized, oh, that doesn't really make sense. And to me, the best example of that was when Vernestra and her Jedi crew went to Kofar and they found all the dead Jedi bodies. And then after taking in the scene, Vernestra says,
"It's time to get back to the ship."
And then she just walks away. Now, at some point, it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong here, in the post-production process, somebody said, well, wait a minute. You can't just have the Jedi walk away from all of these dead bodies and, leave them to rot in the forest. We've got to fix that. So I think that they added a pretty obvious line recorded after the show was shot to explain that they weren't just going to leave the bodies in the forest.
It's time to get back to the ship.
We should prepare these bodies for burial.
Now, you can't both return to the ship and prepare the bodies for burial at the same time, so I think that this was an attempt to stave off the criticism of just walking away from all these dead bodies and not explaining what you're going to do. And I know that it's a small thing, but I think it's another indication that the show wasn't completely thought out all the way. There are all of these loose ends and things that just don't make a whole lot of sense, and the show either has to leave them as is or work somehow to go back and try to make them make sense. And something I had trouble making sense of is the fact that over the course of what seems like one day in a cave, Osha seems ready to go full dark side, which is an even more abrupt turn than May's sudden change of heart and then reversal of that change of heart in the last couple of episodes about turning herself into the Jedi. And on top of that, I think you had an episode that had really bad pacing and an uneven tone. Episode 6 for me was deadly slow, and I'm not a guy that requires all action all the time. I like talky stuff if it keeps me interested. This one didn't really keep me interested though. It just seemed to kind of languish in an attempt to fill out an entire episode, 24 minutes or something, with maybe 15 minutes worth of story. And when you compare it to episode 4, which seemed to have too much to do to fit into the episode length, I think it's just another indication to me that nobody really seemed to know with this show how to give it the proper pace or tempo for a week-to-week release at the episode lengths that they're going for. Because, I mean, we're 6 episodes in. Honestly, we could be an hour and a half into a movie at this point, given the information that we know so far. And that would leave us, 30, 45 minutes to wrap up the story, which is probably about what we're going to get in these next 2 episodes. It feels artificially inflated to make it a series, and that's why it feels like a relic of this bygone streaming era, hopefully, where it was just like pump out a series, pump out a series, pump out a series. There were also a couple of weird tonal shifts, including a borderline slapstick scene where Basil finds May, and then they have a cartoonish fight that ends with May getting sprayed in the face with ship goo. Again, I don't mind comedy in my Star Wars, but it just seems so out of step with everything else that was going on in the episode, and you kind of have to have an eye, as a writer and a director and a creator, for the tone. You have to be tone police at times and say, okay, well, we could maybe do a big comedic scene in this episode, but not so much in this episode. And this felt like an episode where a slapstick fight scene just didn't make a whole lot of sense. There was also something about Vernestra getting sick in hyperspace, which I think is a reference to some Star Wars stuff I haven't seen or read. But she didn't have to hold that barf bag for too long, because even though Coruscant is a core world and Kofar is on the Outer Rim, they were able to make that trip in what seems like an hour or less. And listen, I'll usually give Star Wars a pass on the whole how long does it take to travel somewhere in hyperspace, because sometimes characters are in different places, or we don't know how much time has passed, so we could say, well, they've compressed the timeline, so maybe it was a couple days of travel time. But the timeline was pretty clear here. We had May and Sol that were drifting out in this ship off of Kofar for what seemed like maybe an hour, maybe a few hours at most, and we had the people coming from Coruscant, and they arrived and left within seconds of each other. I mean, there was no wiggle room there as far as, well, maybe they'd been gone for a while, or maybe it took them longer to get there. We see exactly how long it took, and this is another thing that I think you could have avoided those questions with just a little bit more planning, deciding what order the shots were going to go in. But that like simultaneous exit and instant arrival, I get it. It's like, oh, they just missed each other. But the timeline of the episode, it doesn't really make sense with where the characters were located in fictional space, I guess. And I know that some of this seems like nitpicking about small things, but that's the issue here, is I can handle 1 or 2 of these things in an episode. You have to give an episode dramatic license, but this was an episode, and I think it's a series, that's asking you to accept or hand wave off contrivance after contrivance after contrivance. In this episode, it was, okay, well, we'll come up with a halfway explanation for why Sol can't sense anything. We don't really worry about the time travel through space. Osha's going to make a big character turn that we don't really explore fully, and you can get away with some of that, but when you put them all so close together and deliver a poorly paced, largely uneventful episode with what I thought was pretty poor acting and dialogue, and that mainly just seems to serve as a setup for the next episode, that to me is bad writing and bad planning, and it makes me lose faith that we are headed toward a satisfactory conclusion. If I had to guess where we're going to go from here, the English Jedi's seemingly random suggestion that Sol could have been responsible for the massacre on Kofar.
You don't think Master Sol was responsible?
That is quite the accusation.
Leads me to believe that Vernestra will definitely say that Sol is responsible for the massacre on Kofar, which means that the Jedi will cover up this new Sith presence, which means that they can stay in canon with the fact that the Jedi say that the Sith have been extinct for a millennia in The Phantom Menace. Listen, this is a show that doesn't really lay a lot of red herrings, as I found out through trial and error. If they're obviously setting up something that they're going to do, that's exactly the thing they're going to do later on. So yeah, this 6th episode was a rough watch for me. I've given this show a lot of leeway and a lot of faith, but this was enough for me to lose enough of that faith to downgrade my rating of the show from a still hopeful it's fine to a fairly disappointed not a fan. Now, it could still deliver a strong last 2 episodes that would push that rating back up, but given my experience with the show so far, I'm not counting on it. And it is disappointing because people say, well, I mean, it's weird. There's like these conspiracy theories where they're like, well, Dan's not saying what he really means. I am. I never really say anything on this channel that is anything other than what I really mean. But I also was giving this show some room to explore its own storyline, to see where some of these story threads went. And yet over and over again, it just shows me that wherever it says it's going is exactly where it's going. And it thinks it's setting up these big mysteries, but tells us what the answers are to those mysteries 2 or 3 episodes before. It's an utterly unsurprising show. But the problem with that is that it's also a mystery. So when you have an unsurprising mystery, well, that leads to a bit of a letdown from time to time. But what do you think? Do you think these last 2 episodes will actually be able to deliver on the promise and the premise of the show? Let me know down in the comments below. And before we go, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Magic Spoon. I've loved cereal since I was a kid, and it's a frequent meal for me. It's kind of the perfect food, except that it can often contain a lot of sugar and empty carbs that aren't necessarily the best option. But with Magic Spoon, I can have my cereal and eat it too, combining the taste I love with less sugar and high protein. I have the Magic Spoon variety pack that contains 4 flavors: cocoa, fruity, frosted, and peanut butter. This pack has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs with only 140 calories per serving. It's also high protein, has 0 grams of sugar, keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free, and you can build your own bundle with your favorite flavors. My go-to recently has been the fruity flavor, but lately I've also been eating the cocoa flavor a lot, and it's great to have that chocolate taste, knowing that all the sugar you get with other cocoa-flavored cereals isn't also in the bowl. And Magic Spoon cereal stays crunchy in the milk, so I don't feel like I have to rush through my cereal to prevent a soggy mess. Go to magicspoon.com/movies to grab a variety pack and try it today, and be sure to use our promo code MOVIES at checkout to save $5 off your order. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee, so if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, start your day off right with a delicious bowl of high-protein cereal at magicspoon.com/movies and use the code MOVIES to save $5 off. Thanks to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Be sure to stay tuned right here this week. I've got a lot more reviews coming up, including Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F, Maxine, Despicable Me 4. So much left to do. Be sure to stay safe as we go into this July 4th weekend here in the US, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye.